Welcome. Our topic for today is the pharynx. This is our study guide. We have the definition, the functions, the cause or part of the pharynx, the regions that they present, the morphology, what they are made up of, blood supply, and the innervation. The pharynx is also known as the throat. It is a fibromuscular hollow tube, which means that it is made up of fibrous tissue and also muscles. It ranges from between 12 to 14 cm in length, and it tends to be broader in the T-section than in the anterior-posterior section. So this is where the pharynx is, from behind the nasal space down to behind the larynx. So it extends from up here down to this region. So follow suit with this lecture so as to have a broader understanding. The functions. The functions of the pharynx include that they create a common channel for both digestion and respiration, which means that there is a particular region within the pharynx that allows the passage of air and also food. But by the time we go further in this lecture, you will be able to explain and justify why this is so. It also contains tonsils, which are a collection of lymphoid tissue that is used for defense mechanism. They also perform the function of support. They tend to support the surrounding structures, which include the palate, the auditory tube, and the tongue. This is so because some fibers that forms the bulk of the pharynx tends to create a form of extension that connects with this surrounding structure, thereby providing support for self and others. The course of the pharynx. The pharynx runs a major course through the space that they occupy. It begins from behind the nasal cavity. This is the nose race, and this space is the nasal cavity. We have the oral cavity below. The nasal cavity and the oral cavity is separated by the palate. We can do a gross examination of the palate by putting our tongue to the roof of the oral cavity. The entire demarcation that separates the nasal cavity from the oral cavity is the palate, but the one in the anterior part is the hard palate, while the one behind is the soft palate. And this, we can do a gross examination on our own. So you have the nasal cavity, you have the oral cavity. So the space behind the nasal cavity is where the pharynx begins from, and it extends down to the space behind the oral cavity. It goes down to the limit where the esophagus begins. So we can say that the pharynx extends from behind the nasal cavity down to behind the larynx. This is the larynx at the front, which is a structure that is located above the trachea, and you have the esophagus behind. So it extends from behind the nasal cavity down to the inferior border of the trachea, which is formed by the cricoid cartilage. You can go and check out our lecture on the larynx to see the structural component of the larynx. You see that the cricoid cartilage forms the inferior border of the larynx, and that is what marks the limit of the pharynx. More so, the pharynx forms part of the digestive and the respiratory system. So as we go through with this lecture, we would be able to understand why this is so. So follow suit. Subdivisions of the pharynx. The pharynx is divided into three basic subdivisions. We have the nasopharynx, which is also called the epipharynx. Epi means above. This means that it is the most superior part of the pharynx. And it is naso. If you break the name down, naso, it means nasal cavity. So it means the part of the pharynx that is located behind the nasal cavity. So this is the nasal cavity above the palate. So this region of the pharynx that is located behind it is called the nasopharynx. Then the second region is the oropharynx, We also do the same by breaking the name down, oro, which means the oral cavity, and pharynx. So it means the part of the pharynx that is located behind the oral cavity. So this is the oral cavity, and this is the part of the pharynx that is located behind it. So this is the oropharynx. It is also called the nasopharynx, which means the middle part of the pharynx. Then the last region and the most distal part is called the laryngopharynx. If you break the name down, larynx, then pharynx. So it means the part of the pharynx that is located behind the larynx. This is the larynx, as we know. Inferior to it, we have the trachea, then the lungs down below. So the part of the pharynx that is located behind the larynx is called the laryngopharynx. This is also referred to as the hypopharynx, which means the most inferior part of the pharynx. So these are the three subdivisions of the pharynx, and the names are being generated as a result of what is located anterior to them. So let's take it one after the other. The nasopharynx, we already say that it is the most superior part of the pharynx. It begins from the limit of the nasal cavity. This is the nasal cavity, and this is where it terminates. So from here is where the nasopharynx begins from, and it ends at this region, which is called the pharyngeal isthmus. So this is the narrow constriction that is created around the level of the palate. Also, the nasopharynx forms part of the respiratory system. Remember when we say that the pharynx form part of the digestive and the respiratory system. It is not the entire region of the pharynx. So we would be seeing in detail why specific regions are related to specific function. This is the nasopharynx, which is located behind the nasal cavity. This is solely a respiratory region. Why? Because as air goes in through the nose race, it enters into the nasal cavity. From here, then it goes into the nasopharynx. So this is entirely a respiratory region. Food substances cannot find their way into this place because they are located inferior to it. So the part that they go through is downwards and not upward. Hence, this region is solely for respiratory function. The isthmus that we describe as forming the lower boundary of the nasopharynx is formed by the terminal end of the soft palate and the posterior wall of the pharynx. So this region creates a form of constriction. There is a muscular action that occurs within this region, which tends to close up as soon as food substance enters into the oral cavity. This is in a way to prevent the upward movement of food into the nasopharynx. So this is like a control channel, kind of preventing food substances that are within the oral cavity from entering into the nasal cavity. We also have some features in the nasopharynx. Each of the lateral wall of the nasopharynx, we have the opening of the auditory tube. We can actually do also an examination of this structure by using the side of our tongue to scratch the lateral wall of the nasopharynx. We can feel the sensation within the auditory tube. The auditory tube opens into the nasopharynx. Behind this opening, because if you have an opening, that means you have a depression, you will definitely have an elevation. And when you have an elevation, the elevation will be followed with another depression. So the depression behind the opening of the auditory tube forms a recess that is called the pharyngeal recess. This recess contains lymph nodes that helps to drain lymph. Then the oropharynx, which is also referred to as the mesopharynx. By now, we know that the oropharynx is the part of the pharynx that is located behind the oral cavity. It begins from the isthmus that we discussed before that forms the inferior boundary of the nasopharynx, and it goes down and it ends or terminates at the upper border of the larynx. And the upper border of the larynx is formed by the epiglottis. The oropharynx forms part of the digestive and the respiratory system, and we will see this illustration now. If air comes in through the nursery, it goes through the nasal cavity, it enters into the nasopharynx. It has to pass through the oropharynx before it enters into the larynx, then the trachea. Then if food substance enters into the oral cavity, it will go through the oropharynx, go down to the laryngopharynx, then the esophagus. So that is why we say that the oropharynx forms part of the digestive and the respiratory system, because food substances and also air pass through. Then the laryngopharynx, by now we also should know that is a part of the pharynx that is located behind the larynx. This is the larynx. So it begins from the upper border of the epiglottis and it ends around the level of the cricoid cartilage. The upper border of the epiglottis forms the superior border of the larynx, and the cricoid cartilage forms the lower border of the larynx. The laryngopharynx has only a digestive function. As food substances enter into the mouth, they go through the oropharynx. The next place they go is the laryngopharynx. The hair substance crosses at this point to enter into the larynx. This is a diagrammatic illustration of what happens to hair and food movement through the pharynx. Let's look at this image. This is our oral cavity. The hair goes through the nasopharynx, crosses through the pharyngeal isthmus, which is a boundary or a control channel between the nasopharynx and the oropharynx. It goes into the oropharynx, it crosses forward. The epiglottis will open because it is hair. Then it enters into the larynx. From the larynx, then it goes down into the trachea. But if it is the other way around, when you take in food, the food substance is inside the oral cavity. From the oral cavity, it goes to the oropharynx. It does not go upward because of this control gadget, which is the pharyngeal isthmus, which tends to prevent upward movement of food substances. So the food substances are actually directed downwards. So it moves from the oropharynx down to the laryngopharynx, down to the esophagus, then down to the stomach. So you can see that the intercept between hair and food is actually within the oropharynx. Structural components of the pharynx. What makes up the pharynx? We've discussed about the different regions that they have, and I hope that that was interesting enough for you to understand. But the structural component of it is what the bulk of the pharynx is made up of. We've said at the beginning when we define the pharynx that is a fibromuscular tube, which means that it is made up of entirely of fibrous membrane and of muscle. So what it contains can be established into 4 layers. So the first layer is the mucous membrane. This is the deepest layer. It is made up of epithelium lining. So this is like the layer that lines the interior wall of the pharynx. Then the second layer is the fibrous coat. This overlies the epithelium lining, which is the mucous membrane. Then we have the muscular layer, which forms bulk of the pharynx. Then the last layer is the facial coat, which forms the outer covering. It could also be referred to as the buccopharyngeal fascia. We would take this structural component one after the other to see what they're actually made up of. The first one is the pharyngeal mucous membrane. This is the most internal compartment, and it is lined with epithelium. Let's go back to our image. We have said previously that the pharynx is divided into 3 subdivisions. We have the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. These 3 subdivisions are lined with different types of epithelium, and we will see the reason why this is so. Remember, we said that the nasopharynx is the region of the pharynx that lies behind the nasal cavity. This region of the pharynx is lined with a pseudostratified columnar epithelium, because it tends to continue with the type of epithelium lining that is found in the nasal cavity. So it tends to form like a continuous sheet with what it has at the front, while the oropharynx and the laryngopharynx are both lined with a non-keratinized stratified epithelium. So they tend to be lined with the epithelium lining in the structure that is located anterior to them, which is the oral cavity. They also tend to form a continuous sheet with this structure. So all in all, we'll say that the entire pharynx is not lined by the same type of epithelium, but they are lined with different types of epithelium, and which tends to follow suit with the type of epithelium that line structures that are located anterior to them. The pharyngeal fibrous coat, this is like a fascia that tends to overlie the mucous lining. So they tend to be thicker superiorly, and they diminish in terms of thickness as they descend. So they gradually diminish until when you no longer see them. A very unique feature that they present is the posterior median raphe. This membrane tends to form like a thickening, like an elevation at the back, and it tends to form the region where most of the fibers are inserted. By the time we get to the muscular layer of the pharynx, we see that it tends to create a platform onto which the muscles are inserted. So it's like an elevation or a thickening that is formed by this fibrous coat at the back of the pharynx. So the pharyngeal muscle, the muscle forms the bulk of the pharynx. So most of the structural configuration of the pharynx are formed by the pharyngeal muscle. So what they do is to determine the shape of the pharynx. They also undergo some form of contraction and relaxation, which present a form of peristaltic movement. And as they do this, they tend to push the food down the tract, down to the esophagus. They also help to maintain the air space, especially in the nasopharynx, where air passes through. They tend to maintain the opening of the pharynx so that air can freely flow in and flow out. The muscles are arranged in two layers. We have the outer circular layer, which means that the fibers run a circular pattern and are located on the outside. This includes three types of muscle. We have the inferior constrictor, the middle constrictor, and the superior constrictor muscle. The second layer is the inner longitudinal layer, which means that the fibers run a longitudinal pattern and they are located on the inside. And we have the stylopharyngeus, we have the salpingopharyngeus, and we have the palatopharyngeus. If you see the three muscles, you see that they have pharyngeus at their terminal ends, which means that they originate from structures above the pharynx and are innervated into the bulk of the pharynx. The first constrictor muscle is the inferior constrictor, which means that it is the most inferiorly located. It is the thickest of all the three constrictor muscles, and its origination points are in two areas. The first region where it originates from is the thyroid cartilage, while the second region is the cricoid cartilage. These two cartilages form part of the larynx. You can go and check up our lecture on the larynx to understand the configuration of the thyroid cartilage and the cricoid cartilage. So this is where the fibers of the inferior constrictor muscle originate from. They then run posteriorly to be inserted onto the posterior median raphe that we talked about in our previous slide, that is formed by the pharyngeal coat, which is the second layer of the pharynx. The second constrictor muscle is the middle pharyngeal constrictor muscle. This muscle is located between the superior constrictor, somewhere around here, and the inferior constrictor. They originate from the hyoid bone. The hyoid bone is a small bone that is located at the anterior root of the head. So this is where they originate from. After their origination, their fibers is divided into three sections. We have the superior section, the middle section, and the inferior section. The inferior section goes to be inserted beneath the inferior constrictor muscle. So they go downwards to be inserted beneath the inferior constrictor. While the middle fiber runs transversely, the superior fibers then ascend up, then overlap on the superior constrictor muscle. And this therefore creates a fan-shaped appearance with the subdivision of the middle constrictor where the fibers run apart. The third constrictor muscle is the superior constrictor, which means that it's the most superiorly placed, and it creates a form of quadrilateral presentation because of its origination point. This muscle tends to originate from 4 different points. After the origination, their fibers run downwards to be inserted onto the posterior medial raphe. Then going deeper on the superior constrictor muscle, remember we said that the origination point is 4 points, which creates a form of 4-sided presentation. The first point where they originate from is the medial pterygoid plate. The medial pterygoid plate is one of the pterygoid plate or the foot process that is created by the sphenoid bone. You can go and check up our lecture on the neurocranium to see the configuration of the sphenoid bone. So the medial pterygoid plate is where the first origination point of the superior constrictor muscle. The second region where they originate from is the pterygomandibular, which can be felt at the lateral wall of the oral cavity. So as these fibers then originate from this region, they also run along with the other fibers to descend downwards. The third origination point is the posterior side of the tongue. It tends to also follow the trend of pattern of movement of the other fibers that originates from other points. Then we have the myelopharyngeal parts. Myeloid means mandibular. So fibers also originate from the alveolar process of the mandibular bone. So as they originate, they also follow suit with the other fibers that originate from the other region. So all these fibers that originate from the different points run the same pattern downwards and are then inserted on the posterior medial raphe that is created by the pharyngeal coat that we say in our previous slides that it creates insertion points for the muscles. The next group of muscle is the inner longitudinal layer. This runs a vertical presentation and they are located on the inside. Their function basically is to shorten the length of the pharynx, and how they are able to do this is because of the pattern by which they move. They run in a longitudinal version, therefore they are able to alter or manipulate the length of the pharynx through their constriction or relaxation property. So as this group of muscle tends to relax and contract, they concurrently alter the shape of the pharynx. So this is basically their function. And this kind of help to adjust to the process of swallowing. So the inner longitudinal muscle includes the xylopharyngeus, we have the palatopharyngeus and the salpingopharyngeus, because they tend to originate from structures above the pharynx and they run a longitudinal pattern where they now further get inserted onto the bulk of the pharynx. So that is why you have pharynx at their terminal ends. The first one is the stylopharyngeus. All we need to do is to break the name down to know where their origination points are. This is styloid, which means the styloid process of temporal bone. The styloid process is one of the processes that is seen on the pectoral part of the temporal bone. If you go and check up our lecture on the neurocranium, you will see that we describe the temporal bone as being divided into 2 regions. We have the squamous part, which is the thin part, and the pectoral part, which is the thick part. The pectoral part presents some form of transformation, and one of which is the styloid process. The styloid process is a pointed projection that originates at the distal end of the pectoral part of temporal bone, and this is where the origination point of this muscle is. So it originates from the styloid process of the temporal bone and run vertically downwards to be inserted into the bulk of muscles that forms the pharynx. The second muscle is the palatopharyngeus. That means that the palate to the pharynx. So it extends from the palate downwards. Remember, we talked about the palate as a boundary that separates the nasal cavity from the oral cavity. So fibers run from the palate downwards in a vertical version, and they go down to also merge with fibers that forms the bulk of the pharynx. The third inner longitudinal muscle, the salpingopharyngeus muscle, this originates from the eustachian tube down to be inserted into the fibers of the palatopharyngeus. The eustachian tube, it's a tube that connects the middle ear to the nasopharynx. So the fibers originate from this tube and they descend downward. They do not get inserted into the bulk of the muscle that forms the pharynx. They merge with the fiber of the palatopharyngeus muscle. And remember, we've explained that the palatopharyngeus is inserted into the bulk of the pharynx. So the salpingopharyngeus gets inserted into the palatopharyngeus, while the palatopharyngeus gets inserted into the fibers that forms the bulk of the pharynx. The blood supply. The pharynx is supplied by the ascending pharyngeal artery, which branches from the external carotid. Let's still go back to our arc of aorta for adequate understanding. We know that on the arc, we have three emergents. We have the subclavian, we have the common carotid, both on the left, while on the right, we have the brachiocephalic, which further divides into the right subclavian and the right common carotid. The common carotid does further divide into the internal carotid and the external carotid. The internal goes within the cranium to supply structures that are located within it, while the external carotid supplies structures outside on the neck and in the head region. So this external carotid is what beds the ascending pharyngeal artery, which supplies the pharynx. So if we are tracing it backwards, we can say that the ascending pharyngeal artery is a branch of the external carotid, which is a branch of the common carotid, which branches from the brachiocephalic trunk on the right. But on the left is another version. And I hope that we would be able to explain that because there is no brachiocephalic trunk on the left. What we have is the direct emergence of the common carotid. So from the common carotid directly from the heart, we have the internal and the external carotid, where the external then gives branch to the ascending pharyngeal artery. Innervation is by the glossopharyngeal nerve and the vagus nerve. These two nerves tend to supply the sensory and motor innervation of the pharynx respectively, and they are also seen to form anastomosis around the pharynx. So thank you for watching. Let's continue to stay tuned to upgrade our knowledge in anatomy.